Before this one begins, a small note. If you have wandered into this voice by way of the audiobook of The Quiet Country, that recording is available wherever you listen, and a short spoken edition of the same collection is being prepared for late winter. When it is ready, you will see it in the usual places, quiet, unadorned, and free of the bustle we have all grown used to. If you came in by some other road, then I am glad you came in by some other road, and I will not keep you. There are cabins in the Ozarks that count themselves wrong. I do not mean they are haunted in the way people mean when they say haunted at a dinner table and want you to laugh. I mean that the cabin, the boards, the light, the angles, the geometry any child can check with a stick in the dirt, will not add up. You can stand outside in the cold, press your palm flat against the clapboard, and count 4 windows. You can stand inside in the warmth of the stove and count 5. I have spoken to the men who surveyed these places, and they will tell you on paper in their own hand that the number came to 6. The math does not fail because somebody made a mistake. The math fails because the cabin insists on being wrong, and the cabin does this to the same families generation after generation, in the same hill country, with a patience that you do not want to think too long about. This still happens. People in these parts will tell you, in a low voice, that they no longer look up at certain windows of certain cabins they pass on their way home. They just keep their eyes on the road. If you are listening to me from somewhere tonight, I would like you to do a small thing. Tell me in the comments below where you are listening from, and tell me whether you have ever walked into a building and been sure, in some part of you that does not require thinking, that you had walked into a different building than the one you had seen from the road. I read every one. I answer a few, and I am always more astonished than I let on. The voice carries further than I have any right to expect, and it is your voice that keeps me telling. There is one family above all others that this counting fell upon. They were called the Blackwells, and they lived in a stretch of hollow north of the Little Piney that the locals had taken to calling, for reasons no one could quite pin down, Widow's Hollow. Doss Blackwell was 46 years old the spring the counting began, and he was a long man in a country of long men. Tall where the hills cut the wind, lean where the poor cut the fat, with a face that had the color of creek clay and a head of brown hair, he had begun to cut short against the advice of his late wife, who used to say that a man ought to keep at least enough to be worth combing on Sundays. She had been gone 3 years by then. There was a daughter. There was the hollow. There was the work, and there was the remembering. The daughter was Letty. She was 13 that spring, a slight girl with her brown hair kept in a single braid down her back, hazel eyes a half-shade too large for her face, and a habit of holding whatever she had in her hands a little too tightly, as if she expected the world to take it back. She held a rag doll now. She would grow into holding other things, and holding them too tightly was a thing she would carry into her marriage and pass to her own children without knowing she had done so. But that is a thing for later and not for the spring of her 13th year. The hollow was the stretch of country the locals called Widow's Hollow, though there had not been a widow in it for 15 years. The name held because the people of the hills were not in the business of undoing reasons. The hollow ran north off the Little Piney for about 2 miles, narrowing toward a low saddle at the head where a man on horseback could not ride 2 abreast. The cabins stood along the trace the way they had stood since the close of the war between the states, small, single-pen log affairs with stick-and-mud chimneys and porches that had been added and subtracted and added again. Doss's cabin was one of those. It stood up the left fork, just past the second rail fence, set back from the trace some 40 yards in a little flat where the hickories thinned out and the oaks took over. From the outside it looked, the way these cabins looked, unremarkable. For windows across the front. 1 door. A shake roof gone gray with moss. A porch of split oak. Sagging on the right where the frost had heaved the post the winter Doss was 9 years old and had never been heaved back. To a man walking past on the road, to a stranger counting clapboards, the cabin was a cabin, and you could have passed it and thought nothing of it for the rest of your life. That was what Doss thought too for 46 years. He had been born in it, raised in it, married in it. His wife had died in it on a Tuesday in October, in a bed drawn close to the stove, with Letty 16 feet away in the next room pretending she could not hear. He had lived in it as a man lives in a house, not counting it, not measuring it, not troubling himself with its arithmetic. A cabin in those hills was arithmetic only when a man had a reason to count. Doss had no reason to count. In the spring the letters began to come. The letters came from a lawyer in Rolla. That was the first strangeness, because nobody in Widow's Hollow had cause to hear from a lawyer in Rolla, and the second strangeness, because when Doss read the first letter aloud at the supper table to Letty, the words did not seem to belong to him. They belonged, he would say later, to somebody older. They referred to a deed. They referred to a survey. They referred to something called a count of fenestration rendered for the purpose of a reassessment of value, and they were addressed to Doss Blackwell at his usual post office, in the usual hand, with the usual clerk stamp, and they asked him, in pleasant and entirely calm language, whether he had any objection to an inspection of his property by a representative of the state of Missouri, the inspection to be conducted on a date not less than 30 days from the receipt of the letter. Doss did not know what fenestration meant. He looked the word up in a dictionary somebody had left at the schoolhouse 8 winters before he had been born, and the dictionary told him it meant, in plain English, the counting of windows. "They want to count my windows," he said to Letty. Letty did not understand why a man would travel all the way from Rolla to count windows, and neither did Doss, and neither did the neighbors he asked about it over the next few days, and the letters came again at the proper intervals, and the matter was put, in Doss's mind, into the same long drawer where he kept the other matters of the world that did not concern him directly. Friday, after the second letter came, he walked up the trace to the Mounts place, where his sister Lou had taken a husband a few years before, and on the way back, near dusk, his dog Jute, a yellow cur low to the ground, one torn ear, began to behave strangely. Jute sat down on the road about 100 yards short of the cabin and would not come when Doss called. He whined, low and steady, with the kind of whine a dog makes when a thunderstorm is still 3 ridges away. He did not look at the cabin. He looked at the ground. The first count came on the 3rd day after the second letter. Doss was up early that morning, working the well sweep at the corner of the yard with the slow, patient movement he had learned from his father, the handle held in the crook of the wrist, the bucket sent down with the rope sliding clean between the thumb and the scarred second knuckle. Letty was sitting on the porch at his back with her rag doll across her lap, and Jute was lying in the strip of shade at the porch corner, his chin flat on his paws as if he had been awake for hours already and had decided to pretend he had not. He noticed it before he meant to. He noticed it the way a man notices a new scar in a mirror, without alarm at first, and then with the slow movement of a thing he had not yet argued with. He had let the bucket drop to count the swings of the well sweep the way a man counts out fence posts to keep his hands busy, and when he had counted he had stopped, and then he had started again because the first count felt unaccountably off. He counted 4 more times. He counted twice more by 3s. Each time, before the rope drew taut at the bottom of its arc, the count came to 5. He set the well sweep down. He walked to the side of the cabin and stood with his back to the clapboards in the cool morning light, looking out over the hickories, not yet counting anything, not yet meaning to count anything. After a moment he turned, slowly, and counted the windows, and there were 4. He walked around to the front. He counted them again. From the road before the porch there were 4. He walked around to the other flank. From the yard there were 4. He walked up onto the porch and looked back at the cabin the way a stranger might. There were 4. He walked inside. He stood in the doorframe of the kitchen and counted them again, and the count was 5. The 5th window was the one over the washstand, low and wide, set into the wall where no window had been when his father built the place. He had lived in this room for 46 years. He had washed his face in this room in winter and summer, in sorrow and in the long ordinary mornings when nothing was wrong. He had hung a curtain on this window, a curtain of gray calico his wife had cut from a remnant, and the curtain was still there, faded to the color of river fog, and when he pulled the curtain aside the light that came in was the same gray light he had always known, and outside the window there was the same yard, and the same hickories and Jute who would not come up to the porch. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he stepped out into the front room and he counted again. From the front room he counted the kitchen window and 3 of the 4 front windows. The count was 4. He returned to the kitchen. He counted them again. The count was 5. Doss Blackwell did not go down to the road that day. He did not go up to his sister's. He did the work of the farm as he had done the work of the farm for 20 years, with patience and with care, and he said nothing about the count. On the 4th day, in the afternoon, while Letty was at the schoolhouse, he walked the cabin with a stub of pencil and a scrap of brown paper from a feed sack, and he wrote down what he saw. From the road, front, 4. From the yard, 4. From the porch, looking back. 4. From the kitchen door. 5. From the back bedroom. 4. From the loft ladder. 4. He wrote the count down with the same slow, deliberate hand he used for fence post tallies and for the livestock marks. He set the scrap of paper on the kitchen table and weighed it down with a saucer. By the 6th day of the count, Letty had noticed. You understand what that meant. A girl of 13 is not a woman grown, and she is not, in any ordinary sense of the word, a person to consult on matters of geometry. But Letty had been the daughter of a careful man and the daughter of a woman who had been more careful than her husband, and she had grown up in a household where the cataloging of small, specific things was the closest thing the family had to a religion. She noticed the pencil. She noticed the saucer. She lifted the saucer after supper that same evening, when Doss was outside splitting kindling, and she read what the paper said, and she read it again and she said it back. She said nothing. She did not mention it on the 7th day or on the 8th day. On the 8th day she asked, in the voice of a girl who had already decided that the asking was the wrong move and was doing it anyway, whether Papa had looked at the kitchen window lately. Yes, Doss said. And how many are there in the kitchen, Papa? 5, he said. Letty nodded. She did not look at the kitchen window. She did not go in to look. She asked, with the same careful calm her mother would have used on a question that could not be answered, how many there were from outside. For Doss said. Letty nodded again. She took a breath the way a child takes a breath when she is about to say something she has been composing in her head for 2 days. She said, do you think we ought to count it once more? By the 10th day, more than the kitchen window had begun to slip. That is the way to put it, because the word Doss was reaching for in his own slow mind was not the word shifting, and it was not the word appearing, and it was not any of the louder words his late wife's brother would have reached for at the supper table. The cabin was not appearing wrong, and it was not shifting wrong. The cabin was slipping, the way a man, in the last days of a long illness, slips, without a sound and without a fuss, and with the kind of patient determination that a child can feel in the room long before the child can speak. On the 11th day Doss found a second window that was only there when he was looking for it. He had gone into the loft for a truss of dried sage Letty needed for a poultice. The loft was dark the way it had always been dark. He climbed the ladder with the lamp in his left hand and the truss in his right. He set the truss down. He straightened up. The lamp flame, which had been steady against the draft as he climbed, suddenly steadied more, as if the room had grown larger around him. He looked up, set into the slope of the roof on the east side, where he had always remembered only the closed boards of the gable. There was a window he had never seen. A square of glass about the size of a dishpan, in an oak frame, showing a bare hickory branch against a sky the color of wet slate. He climbed down. He walked outside. He climbed the woodpile until his head was above the eave line, and he looked up at the east gable. The gable was closed. The boards were still in place. The nails, in the year he was born, were still in their holes. There was no window. There was no frame. He climbed down. He stood in the yard for a long minute, looking at the gable from a different angle. He went inside. He climbed the ladder. He raised the lamp. The window was still there, square and plain, the way the kitchen window had been plain, with the same steady light falling through it from a sky that looked low and cold and far. He climbed down. He did not go back up that night. On the 14th day, a second window appeared, this one in the back bedroom where Letty slept. He had gone in to leave a folded quilt at the foot of her bed, and there on the wall above the small writing desk her mother had used for years, a wall he had looked at 10,000 times, a wall against which his wife's portrait had hung for 15 years before she died. There was a window he had never seen, with a curtain of faded blue calico on the inside and a view of the yard he could not have mistaken for any other view. Through it the hickories looked exactly as the hickories looked from the back porch. The same branching, the same broken limb over the same bend in the same path. He went around to the back porch. He stood where Letty could not see him. He looked at the wall of the back bedroom from the outside. There was no window. The clapboards were unbroken. The nails were tight. The wall was the wall. He went inside by the kitchen door. He walked out into the back bedroom. The window was still there. The curtain was still drawn halfway. The light was still the light of late afternoon. Over the next 10 days Doss counted again. slowly and without flinching, with the stub of pencil and a fresh scrap of brown paper for each pass. From outside the cabin, on every side, on every porch, there were 4 on the front and 4 on the back and 2 on each flank, and the count was steady and would not move. From inside the cabin the number would not stay still. From the kitchen it was 5. From the front room it was 4. From the back bedroom it was 5. From the loft it was 5. From the loft ladder halfway up it was 4. From the front room looking back into the kitchen it was 6. From the kitchen looking into the front room it was 4. On the 15th day, in the late afternoon, he walked the cabin end to end one more time, and the count was 8. The attic window was still there. The kitchen window was still there. The back bedroom window was still there. The new window over the stairs was there now, and a 5th window, narrow and tall in the closet of his late wife's wardrobe, was there now, and a 6th window over the back porch stoop, and a 7th somewhere above the loft ladder that he could not bring himself to look at directly. He set the pencil down. He walked out of the cabin. He stood on the front porch in the dusk and looked at the cabin from the road. There were 4 windows across the front. There had been 4 windows across the front every day of his life. There were 4 windows across the front now. Jute was lying under the porch with his head on his paws and would not come out. Toward the 20th day of the count, Doss rode the mule up the trace to the mount's place a final time, and this time he did not engage Lou in the small talk of kinfolk. He sat on his hat in the kitchen and spoke low about the count. He spoke about it the way a man speaks when he has already tried it against the inside of his own head for weeks and the inside of his own head has come up short. Lou listened without interrupting. When he was done, she did not offer an explanation. She offered him a name. "You ought to go up and talk to Mr. Cruz," she said. "Papa's people knew of him. He was a surveyor in his working life, and there isn't a deed in the head of the hollow he has not had his hand on at one time or another, and he is not a man given to nonsense. But he has been at our place a few times in the last 10 years, and the last time he came for the survey he made a mark in his book on a thing he would not explain to me, and I believe it was the same thing." Doss asked how to find him. Lou told him to ride the ridge road north past the second gap until he came to a clearing with a smokehouse at the back and a dog tied to a length of logging chain under a chinaberry tree, and the dog would bark in a particular way, once, twice, then a long silence, and the silence was how he would know he had the right place. The dog barked once. The dog barked twice. There was the long silence. Asaph Cruz was just past 70 when Doss first met him, and he was already what the country called a small man, wiry where the long men were long, with a brow that ran forward over his eyes the way a stone runs forward over a creek, a nest of white hair he had stopped trimming in his middle 60s, and the sort of posture a man has when he has spent a working life bent over a surveyor's transit and has decided he is done bending. He wore a coat of gray wool that had been his father's, and the cuffs were patched twice, once with brown thread, once with thread of a darker brown, and his hands were the hands of a man who had worked the chain and the rod through 40 winters. He invited Doss in without introducing himself, because he had heard the news from the trace weeks before, and he put a kettle on the stove, and he asked Doss to speak. Doss spoke. He spoke in the long, plain way of the hills, with no ornamentation and no embarrassment. He laid the scraps of brown paper on the table between them, and Asaph looked at them without rushing. After a long minute Asaph picked up the pencil and very quietly made a small needle prick in a corner of the topmost sheet. He set the pencil down. He said, "I cannot tell you what your cabin will become." He paused. He said, "I cannot tell you how many windows it will come to." He paused again. He said, "I can tell you that I have measured 3 cabins in this hollow, and the 3 of them lived in the family I have heard you called by the name of, and on the row they were one of the deeds I made a mark about. And I can tell you that on the night I closed the book on the 3rd of them, I walked out to my porch and I found I could not count the windows of my own house, and the count was 5, and I have never gone back inside the way I used to. I sleep in the smokehouse now, and I sleep in the smokehouse because I would rather count the smokehouse's 2 windows than count my own house's 5. He did not say why. He did not say how. He said only this, with the careful, slow pity of a man who had once tried to find out and had decided against it. "I have to be careful now. The not telling is on purpose. A fence is worth what a fence is worth to a man on a dark road, and which side you stand on decides what it keeps. If you would rather stay where you are, I would not press the rules on you. Doss looked at him for a long time. He said, "What would you have me do?" Azaf said, "On a Tuesday, between sunrise and the hour a child comes home from school, I would take the girl down to the schoolhouse. And I would take a chair out to your front porch. And I would set the chair where a man sitting in it could see the same 4 windows, and nowhere else, and I would sit there until the count came back. If it does not come back that morning, then the count has decided where you will go from here, and I would not be writing down what I see. I would be writing down what the cabin has chosen." He set the pencil down a second time, and the small needle prick he had made in the corner of the paper was still there. Doss rode the mule home in the gray dusk, and he sat on his porch until Jute came up on his own and put his chin against Doss's boot. Let us go back to the story. Have you ever known, in your body, that something was wrong in a place where you were safe? Not the loud wrong of an accident, not the small wrong of a forgotten errand, the quiet wrong, the kind that settles into the nape of your neck the way a thread of cold settles into a room when the hearth goes out. I have heard from people all across this country who have known this wrong in a hallway, in a kitchen at night, in a room they have lived in for 20 years. If you have known it, tell me in the comments below whether you stayed or whether you left. I read every one. The answer I get most often, when people answer honestly, is the answer the hills would give me, which is that they did not leave the room until they had to. On the 22nd day of the count, Doss set the chair on the porch. He had spent 2 days preparing in the slow, patient way a man prepares for an undertaking he does not understand. He set the chair by the second post from the right, where the morning light would fall across his knees and not across his eyes. He had Letty walk down to the schoolhouse early, the way Azaf had told him to on the Tuesday between sunrise and the hour she came home. He had put a mug of well water on the porch rail, and he had sat down. He had set his hands flat on his knees. He had looked at the 4 windows of the front of his cabin, and the 4 windows looked back at him, and the count was 4. The morning passed. The sun rose above the trace and the porch fell into shade. A wren sang from the hickory at the corner and then stopped, the way wrens stop, without ceremony. Jute lay under the porch with his chin flat and would not lift his head. By the 8th hour, when the light had come around to the west of the cabin, Doss had counted 4 windows for an unbroken run of nearly 6 hours, and his shoulders had come down out of their set, and he had begun to allow himself, slowly, the thought that the count had decided to come back. He would write it down that afternoon, when Letty was home. He would write it down and he would take the scrap of paper down to the trace office in the morning, and he would file it and the count would be done with. At the 9th hour, the wren returned. It came back to the hickory and sang the same song, and Doss did not look up at it. And then the wren stopped again, and the silence that followed was not the silence of a wren being quiet. It was the silence of a man setting down a tool. A window appeared above the kitchen door. There was no sound. There was no shift of light. There was no jarring of the boards. The window was simply there, narrow, tall, set in a frame that had been the closed wall above the kitchen door since the year his father built the place. Through it Doss could see the kitchen table, and the saucer where he had pressed the brown paper, and, on the kitchen wall beyond, the hooked rug of brown wool his wife had woven the winter Letty was born. And then a second window appeared beside it, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, 6 windows in a row above the kitchen door, where there had been no windows at all, each one looking onto a different piece of the same kitchen he had just left an hour before. The count was no longer 4 from outside. The count was 10. Doss stood up off the chair. He did not run. He did not speak. He went inside by the kitchen door and he counted, and the count was still 10, and the curtains on the new windows were all of the same faded calico, all cut from the same remnant his wife had used for the kitchen curtain, and Jute was whining under the porch with the low, steady whine of an animal that cannot be comforted. The plan had been to sit on the porch until the count came back. The plan had not included the count climbing from 4 to 10 between the 9th hour and the noon hour. The plan had not included Azaf being 3 ridges away by the road, and Letty being at the schoolhouse, and the count being many more than the count being back. The plan had been a quiet plan, and the cabin had decided that the quiet plan was not the plan it was willing to wait for. Doss walked out onto the porch. He sat down on the chair. He looked at the cabin. Outside, on the front of the cabin, 10 windows looked back at him, and Jute had buried his head under the porch boards with his hindquarters still showing, and Doss Blackwell sat on the chair his wife had not sat in for 3 years, and he counted the windows of the front of his own house, and the number was 10. The number was 10 outside. The number was 10 from the porch. The number was 10. On the 23rd day, at about 11:30 of the morning, with the count at 10 and Jute refusing all food and water, and with Letty home from the schoolhouse sitting cross-legged on the porch with her doll across her lap, Doss Blackwell did the thing he had decided against the night before. He walked down to the trace and turned south toward Rolla. He did not go to the lawyer's office. He had already decided the lawyer's office was no place to take a man who had counted the windows of his own house at 10. He went instead to the county surveyor's office on the square, because the surveyor's office was the place where the count of a house was kept on paper if the count of a house was kept on paper at all, and if the count of a house had got away from him, the place to ask was the place where the count lived. He walked in. He waited. He was ushered up to a clerk at a desk near the back of the building. The clerk was a thin man of about 60, with a long mustache he had waxed in 2 careful points and a pair of spectacles that he had the habit of taking off when he was about to refuse a thing, and he took the spectacles off as Doss was finishing his question. 4 from the road, Doss said. 10 from the porch as of yesterday morning. 5 from the kitchen. 6 from the front room looking back. 10, the clerk said. He wrote the number down without changing his expression. From the porch. From the porch, Doss said. And the deed, the clerk said. He pulled a drawer. He spread a long brown envelope open across the desk between them. Let me see what we have on file. The clerk ran his finger down the column. He ran his finger down a second time. He looked up. He set his spectacles on the desk. He put them back on. He took them off again. He said, Mr. Blackwell, the deed on file for your property does not show 4 windows. The deed on file for your property shows 6. 6, Doss said. 6, the clerk said. Drawn in this office in the year 1891 by your husband's grandfather on the maternal side. Witnessed by A.S. Mounts and an A. Cruz. Doss sat down because the chair was the nearest thing to him and he needed to sit. He said, What is the count on the inside? I cannot tell you from the outside, the clerk said. The records office is not in the habit of recording the inside count of anyone's home. We record what we can verify with the transit. And what you can verify, Doss said. 6, the clerk said. 6 at the time of survey. 6 on the face of the deed. 6 in the column where the matter of fenestration was drawn and witnessed underhand. He paused. He said, It is a peculiar column, Mr. Blackwell. I have inherited from my predecessor a small note in the margin. I am not a man given to speculation on the notes of my predecessors. But the note is there. The note refers to a count to be reconciled by the owner of the property at the time, in his own hand, on a Tuesday morning between sunrise and the hour a child returns from school. The note does not say what the count should come to. The note only says the count should be made. Doss thanked the clerk and walked out onto the square. He stood on the curb for what he calculated later to be the better part of an hour, and then he walked back to the mule and rode home in the dusk. It was on this ride home that the count decided to make itself felt in a way the count had not made itself felt before. The mule stopped at the second gap of the ridge road and would not go forward. Doss dismounted and walked her by the bit for the better part of a mile, and the mule, when he mounted her again, threw him gently into a stand of sassafras, and he walked the last 2 miles home on foot because the mule would not go back up the road and he was too tired to argue. He came into the yard in the dark. He came up onto the porch. Letty was asleep inside, on the front room bed, with her doll across her arm. He stood on the porch in the dark and he counted the windows of the front of his cabin, and the count was 4. The real-world confirmation of what the count had done came in 3 quiet pieces, none of them on the same day, and none of them by way of the Blackwells. The first piece came on the 26th day. The county surveyor himself, a man named Ellery Thorne, drove his buckboard up the trace to Widow's Hollow and parked it in the flat below the second rail fence and walked the rest of the way up on foot because his mare was lathered and he did not want her standing the heat. He had with him a long brown envelope and a copy of the deed drawn in 1891, and when he reached the cabin and counted the windows from the road, he found the count to be 4. He did not step onto the porch. He stood for a long minute with his hands in his pockets, looking at the front of the cabin the way a man looks at the face of someone he has known for a long time. He walked around to the back. He counted again. He walked to the sides. He came back to the road. He said to Doss, without looking up, on the face of the deed, "There are 6. By my hand this morning, by the transit, by the standard chain, there are 4. I am prepared to amend the record to 4, Mr. Blackwell. I am prepared to certify what I have seen. What I am not prepared to do is enter the cabin to count on the inside." "Why not?" Doss said. Thorne took his time. He said, "Because the records of this office are bound to what can be seen from a public right-of-way. The cabin's outside is on the public right-of-way. The cabin's inside is your affair, and I have no power to count on your behalf what a man has counted on his own." Doss asked him, in the careful voice of a man who has decided he does not want the answer too badly, what a previous surveyor might have done. Thorne hesitated. He did not want to speak. He spoke. He said, "There is a man in Rolla, Mr. Blackwell, who retired from this office in the year 1908. He was a predecessor of mine. He sat at the desk I now sit at. He drew the deed on your property. And I have it from his daughter. She wrote to me on the matter of a survey on another property, a year ago this spring. I have it from her, in her own hand, that on the night he closed the book on the matter of your family's holdings, he went home to his own house, and in his own house he found that he could not count the windows by the lamps. He took to sleeping in his workshop. He would never say why. He was a precise man. And the count on his own house," Doss said. "His daughter did not say. His daughter did not number the count. She said only that he had stopped counting on the inside." Thorne thanked him and walked back down to the buckboard and drove away in the dust. The second piece came on the 29th day, in a letter from Asaph Cruz. Asaph wrote, in his own careful hand, on a sheet of foolscap, that the count on his own house had come back to 2 on the morning of Doss's first morning sitting on the porch with the saucer on the rail, and that he would not speak to Doss about the count from then on, because the count had been settled for him at the cost of a chair and a morning, and the settlement belonged to him and not to the writing of it down. The third piece came from the records office at Jefferson City. Doss wrote, on the 32nd day, a single line in his own hand, and posted it along with a copy of the deed. He asked whether any record existed of an amendment to the count of his property, prior to his own letter. He asked whether any predecessor in his line had recorded a count in the column his grandfather had drawn. He asked, more quietly, whether any record existed of a count on the inside. What came back to him in October was a single sheet of foolscap stamped with the state seal. It said, in the careful language of the office, that no record existed of an inside count of any property held by the state. It said in a margin in pencil, in a hand that did not belong to any clerk at the office, in a script so faint Doss had to read it by the stove, "We have not, in the records of this office, the inside count of anything. The inside is not the authority of the state." It said, in the same faint hand, in the same margin on the second page, "The Blackwells have asked. We have nothing to give." The letter confirmed what the cabin had been confirming all spring. The record office could not tell Doss what he had seen. The clerk at the desk in Rolla could not tell him. The surveyor could not tell him. Asaph Cruz, who had once been able to tell a man more than was comfortable to tell, would not now tell him anything. The count was real in the sense that the count was something people could sit with and could write down and could be touched in the dark by the hand of a daughter. The count was not real in the sense that no one outside the cabin could make the count part of the public record. The Cabinet of Curiosities of the state of Missouri had, in its careful books, no shelf for what the Blackwells had been counting. The count settled on the 34th day. Not again. Came back. Settled. The choice of word is the word the family used afterward, around the supper table when there was company, and the word is offered the way the Blackwells offered it, with patience, and with the same long allowance for the kind of stranger who would rather have a word that explained itself. Letty was home that midday because the schoolhouse had let out early on account of the weather. Doss was at the porch rail with the saucer in his hand, turning it in his palm the way a man turns a thing he no longer needs, and Letty came up the trace at the second bell, with her braid undone by the wind and her rag doll hanging out of her satchel by one foot. She stepped up onto the porch, and she did not look at the front of the cabin. Doss understood that she had decided, in the patient way a 13-year-old girl decides the things she has to decide for herself, that she was not going to count what was on the front of the cabin that morning. He turned the saucer twice in his palm. He said, "Letty." "Yes, Papa." "How many would you say?" She looked at the cabin, finally, with the long look of a girl who had been raised in it. She looked at the 4 windows across the front of the house where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her grandmother had stood with her chin over the washbasin and sung the old songs in the old language, and she said, with her chin raised and her jaw set the way her mother would have set her jaw at a thing that would not be argued, "For Papa." Doss nodded. He went inside. He came back out. He said, "For from the porch." They sat on the porch in the warm noonday and counted 4 from every angle, and the count was 4 from the road and 4 from the porch and 4 from the woodpile and 4 from the well, and from inside the count was 4 from the kitchen and 4 from the front room and 4 from the back bedroom and 4 from the loft and 4 from the loft ladder and 4 from the closet in his late wife's wardrobe. The count was 4. The count was not coming back. Letty, in a voice very small, asked if she could run down to the schoolhouse and tell the teacher the count was over. Doss told her she could. She ran down the trace with her satchel banging against her leg and her rag doll trailing by its one good foot, and Jute got to his feet under the porch and followed her at a distance with his head lowered, which was the way Jute walked when the cabin was back, and the way Jute walked for the rest of his life. 5 years later, in the spring Letty was 18, she married a young man named Whit Harbison from out Crocker Way, a long man in a country of long men with red hair and freckles and a quiet laugh, and they moved into the cabin in the fall of the year. Doss had built, by then, in the patient way a man builds when he has decided to share a house with a daughter he loves, a small addition onto the back of the cabin, a single room with a low ceiling and 2 windows of the size of dinner plates, set into the clapboards so they looked, from the yard, like a man had hung them up and then walked away and forgotten why. Whit did not count them. Whit had been raised in a family where count did not come into the morning conversation, and Whit was satisfied with the count of 2 that came from any chair he could sit down in to look at them. Doss did not contradict him on this. Doss was, by then, the kind of man who did not contradict anything that did not need to be contradicted. Letty had 2 children in the cabin, a boy and then a girl, and the girl was named for Doss's late wife and given a slight hawkish look of brow that everybody in the family agreed was a small unfairness but that nobody was willing to dispute with the Lord. Doss lived in the addition. Whit lived in the main cabin. Letty walked between the 2 with her hands always full and always held too tightly, the way her mother had held things. Jute died in the cabin on a September afternoon when Letty's girl was 4, and was buried under the chinaberry by the smokehouse, and Letty's girl grew up believing that the chinaberry was the place the family kept its promises. In the 18th year after the count came back, in the spring of 1936, Doss Blackwell died in the addition with the low ceiling. He was 64 years old, and the count on the cabin at the time of his death was 6 from the porch, in the afternoon, in the half hour before the rain came on. Whit, who had not been a man given to counting anything, walked the cabin end to end the morning after the funeral and found the count to be 6 from the kitchen and 6 from the front room and 6 from the loft and 6 from the closet in Doss's late wife's wardrobe. He sat down on a kitchen chair and he did not move for an hour. Letty sat beside him and held his hand in hers, the way a woman holds a thing she has decided to keep. The count on the cabin was, in 1936, 6. The count on the cabin was, in 1954, 6. The count on the cabin was, in 1972, 6. The count on the cabin today in this present year is 6. People in Widow's Hollow still count, when they pass on the road in the early morning, by the habit the Blackwells gave them. They have stopped counting the windows of any house but their own. They still hold their eyes on the road. And on a Tuesday morning in late spring, between sunrise and the hour a child returns from school, a man sitting on his porch with the light falling across his knees will sometimes pause for a long minute and look at the front of his own house and decide, without ever speaking the decision, that he will count the windows of his own house exactly 4 times, and no more, and only from the road. There is a thing Letty still does. She is, by this present year, a woman past 70, and her hair has been gray for a long while, and her back has bent in the same gentle bend her mother's back bent, and she lives in the addition Doss built for himself in the last year of his life because the rest of the house is more house than she wants to keep up. Each morning, in the half hour after coffee, she walks out onto the addition porch with a saucer in her hand, the same saucer or a saucer so like the old one she could not herself tell you which is which, and she sets the saucer on the rail and she stands for what she says is a count of 60 and she does not look anywhere but at the road. She does not look up at the windows. She does not look up at the second story. She does not look up at the line where the addition clapboards meet the clapboards of the cabin Witt and Doss raised up in 1898 and patched and repatched through the long working life of the family. She looks at the road. She looks at the hickory at the bend of the path. She listens in a way very few people still listen, for the little sounds of a still morning in a small hollow. She has told me about this. She has told me in a letter I keep in the wooden box I keep my letters in, that what she is doing on the porch is the thing her pawpaw did on the porch on the Tuesday the count came back. She is counting the saucer as a man counts out the counting of a thing he has decided not to count, and the saucer is the same saucer, and the morning is the same morning, and the ritual is the way she has chosen to be the careful one in a family the careful ones held intact. If you have ever known a place that asked you to do a small, quiet, unarguable thing on its behalf, you have known the country Letty lives in. I would be glad, in the comments below, to hear any piece of your own. A corner of a kitchen, a fence line, a door you no longer open all the way, a window you learn to count by heart. And if you tell it well enough, it might just become the next story I tell. There is another family I have been carrying with me for some while, out past the head of the Piney, along the road to a place the locals were once in the habit of calling the church that sang in winter, and I have begun to wonder whether their record will be one I ought to put down. Be the careful one. Mind the count on the front of your own house, and mind the morning you choose to make it on.